June 6, 1944, 4 a.m. Thousands of teenage boys are crammed into metal boats crossing dark water toward a beach they cannot see. Most of them are vomiting. All of them are terrified. In 2 hours, 4,400 of them will be dead. But right now, in this moment, they don't know that yet. They only know one thing: pause. That when those metal doors drop open, they have to run forward into the bullets. This is the story of the longest day in history. The day ordinary farm boys and factory workers changed the world forever, beat, and what they did in the next 24 hours will break your heart. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, thousands of young men, boys really, most barely old enough to vote, stood crowded in the bellies of landing craft, bouncing across the English Channel toward a coastline they could not yet see. They could hear it, though, the thunder of naval guns, the scream of rockets, and beneath it all, their own hearts pounding like drums in their chests. Many of them were seasick. Some were praying. Others clutched photographs of sweethearts and mothers, talismans against what waited in the darkness ahead. A few tried to joke, their laughter hollow against the roar of the engines. Most were simply silent, alone with thoughts too heavy for words. They were Americans and British, Canadians and Poles, French and Norwegians and dozens of other nations. They spoke different languages, came from different worlds. Farms in Kansas, fishing villages in Newfoundland, coal towns in Wales, streets in Brooklyn. But in those moments before dawn, they shared something profound. They were terrified, and they were determined, because they understood, perhaps not in the grand strategic terms of generals and politicians, but in the simple human way that matters most, that the world needed them to be brave, just for a few hours, just long enough to reach that beach. Let me take you to that beach. Omaha, Utah, gold, Juneau, sword, 5 strips of sand that would become the hinge upon which history turned. As the ramps dropped on those landing craft, men stepped not onto beaches, but into a maelstrom of fire and metal and screaming chaos. The Germans had turned these French shores into fortresses of concrete and steel, every approach measured and sighted, every sector a killing ground. On Omaha Beach, that terrible, beautiful stretch of sand, the first waves were cut down like wheat before a scythe. Boys who had left England alive arrived in France dead, never making it beyond the waterline. The tide turned red. Private Robert Sales, age 19, from Bedford, Virginia, fell in the first minutes. So did his neighbors. 30 young men from one small town gone before breakfast, Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment. The Bedford boys, most of their families wouldn't learn the truth for weeks. Medic Robert Wright pulled men from the water, patched what wounds he could, held the hands of those he couldn't save. Again and again he went back. I just kept thinking, he later said, somebody's mother is waiting for this boy to come home, but here is what happened. On those beaches, and this is important, they did not retreat, despite the plan falling apart, despite the horror beyond anything training could prepare them for, despite having every reason to break, to surrender, to seek any shelter from the storm of steel raining down upon them. They pressed forward. There is a particular kind of courage that emerges not in the absence of fear, but in spite of it. Not because you don't understand the danger, but because you understand it completely and you go anyway. That's what happened on D-Day. Sergeant John Ellery, pinned down on Omaha, later tried to explain it. There wasn't any heroic feeling about it. It was just get the hell off this beach or die. Colonel George Taylor, standing amid the carnage, shouted words that would echo through the day. There are 2 kinds of people who are staying on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. And somehow, through raw determination, Small acts of individual bravery, officers and enlisted men alike leading by example, they began to move. Small groups finding gaps, engineers blowing obstacles, rangers scaling impossible cliffs at Pointe-du-Hoc. Inch by bloody inch they advanced. But we must remember this too, the cost. By nightfall, approximately 4,400 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded or missing. Thousands of families would receive telegrams. Thousands of mothers would weep. Thousands of futures, marriages that would never happen, children never born, books never written, songs never sung, vanished into the sand and surf of Normandy. On the German side, too, young men died, many of them conscripts fighting for a cause they may not have believed in, trapped in fortifications by a regime that valued them only as instruments of war. The tragedy of war is that it demands the sacrifice of the young for the mistakes of the old. We cannot sanitize this. We must not romanticize it. D-Day was not glorious. It was horror. It was trauma that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. But it was also necessary because behind those Atlantic walls across occupied Europe, millions waited in darkness, Jews hiding in attics, resistance fighters in prison cells, entire nations crushed beneath the boot of totalitarian evil. They waited for hope. They waited for liberation. And on June 6, 1944, it came wading ashore through blood and seawater. By the end of that longest day, 156,000 Allied Trar. Oops had landed in France. The foothold was tenuous, the fighting far from over. The war would grind on for 11 more brutal months. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The fortress wall had been breached. The tide had turned. Not just the tide of the ocean, but the tide of history itself. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten, shot multiple times on Omaha Beach, wrote later, "As I hit the beach, I felt that I was the only one left alive. I looked back and saw the ocean red with blood." But here's what he also wrote. "I've asked myself 1,000,000 times, was it worth it? And every time I think of the world my children grew up in, free, at peace, I know the answer. Yes, it was worth it. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet, peaceful. Tourists walk where soldiers fell. Children play in the surf where young men drowned. The concrete bunkers remain weathered and silent monuments to a day when the fate of civilization hung in the balance. In the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, 9,388 white crosses and stars of David stand in perfect rows overlooking Omaha Beach, each one marking a life, a story, a family forever changed. And if you stand there in the silence and let yourself truly see them, not as numbers, not as symbols, but as people, you understand something profound about the price of freedom. It is not free. It never has been. It is purchased again and again by the courage of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, by farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit and immigrants seeking a better life, all willing to give everything for a world they would never see. On the morning of June 6, 1944, those young men stepping off those land, Craft didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as scared kids doing a job that needed doing. But they were heroes, every single one of them, the ones who survived and the ones who didn't, the ones who charged forward and the ones who froze in terror and then charged forward anyway, the ones who pulled their friends from the water and the ones whose bodies were never recovered. They were heroes because when the world needed them, they answered. They ran toward the sound of guns. They chose their brothers and their mission and their cause over their own survival. They gave us tomorrow. So let us remember them, not just with ceremonies and speeches, but in how we live, in how we treat one another, in what we're willing to stand for and stand against. Let us remember that freedom is fragile, that democracy is not self-sustaining, that every generation must decide whether the sacrifices of the previous generation will be honored or squandered. Let us remember that on June 6, 1944, the world learned something essential about the human spirit, that in our darkest hours, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage. And let us never forget the boys who never came home from those beaches, who gave up first loves and wedding days, careers and grandchildren, all the beautiful, ordinary moments that make a life worth living. They gave them up for us, for strangers they would never meet, for a future they would never see. The least we can do, the very least, is remember. Long pause. On June 6, 1944, the sun rose over Normandy on 156,000 soldiers landing on hostile shores. By sunset, it set on a different world, and we are still living in the world they died to create. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, thousands of young men stood crowded in the bellies of landing craft, bouncing across the English Channel toward a coastline they could not yet see. They could hear it, though, the thunder of naval guns, the scream of rockets, and beneath it all their own hearts pounding like drums in their chests. These were not the fearless warriors of Hollywood legend or propaganda posters. These were boys, most barely old enough to vote, and they were absolutely terrified. Private Robert Sales from Bedford, Virginia, was 19 years old. In those final hours before dawn, he likely thought of his mother, his hometown, the girl he danced with at the county fair. He was seasick. His hands were shaking. He knew what awaited him on that beach because the officers had been brutally honest during the briefings. Some of you won't make it off the landing craft. Some of you won't make it past the waterline. This is going to be hell, and we need you to go anyway. And here is the profound truth that we must understand about D-Day, about courage itself. Robert Sales was afraid. They were all afraid. The fear was so thick in those landing craft, you could taste it, mixing with the salt spray and diesel fumes and vomit. Sergeant John Ellery later described looking at the faces of the men around him and seeing his own terror reflected back 100 times over. Nobody was pretending to be brave. There was no point. They all knew. But fear, we learned from Normandy, is not the opposite of courage. Fear is the prerequisite for courage. You cannot be brave about something that doesn't frighten you. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act, despite fear so overwhelming that every instinct in your body is screaming at you to run, to hide, to do anything except move forward into that maelstrom of fire and steel. When those ramps dropped and the German machine guns opened up, the noise was beyond description. The 50 caliber rounds hitting the landing craft sounded like massive hammers striking metal. Men at the front were cut down instantly. The water turned red. Boys who had been joking nervously just moments before were suddenly dying, crying out for their mothers, drowning in 3 feet of water weighed down by 60 pounds of equipment. And every single man in those landing craft understood in that instant that stepping off that ramp likely meant death. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't training. The evidence was right there in front of them, bodies floating in the surf, the beach already littered with the dead and dying, tracers lighting up the dawn like deadly fireworks, explosions sending up geysers of sand and shrapnel. Private First Class Harold Baumgarten stepped off his landing craft into chest-deep water and immediately saw his closest friend killed beside him. He was hit himself multiple times, bullets tearing through his face and body. He should have died. Many around him did. And yet somehow, bleeding and broken, he kept moving forward. Not because he wasn't afraid, he was terrified. Not because he wanted to be a hero, he just wanted to survive. But he understood in some fundamental way that the only path to survival was forward, not back. This is what we must grasp about the courage displayed on those beaches. It was not superhuman. It was profoundly Hingley human. These men were not immune to fear. They were drowning in it. But they had made a decision, perhaps weeks before, perhaps in that very moment, that there were things more important than their fear. Their brothers beside them, the mission they'd been given, the people waiting for liberation across Europe, the world their children would inherit. Medic Robert Wright waded back into the killing zone again and again, pulling wounded men from the water, applying tourniquets with shaking hands, whispering words of comfort to boys who would be dead in minutes. He was terrified every single time. He later said that each time he went back, he was certain it would be the last, that the next bullet had his name on it. But he went anyway, because someone's son needed help, because someone's brother was bleeding out. Because this is what courage looks like, not the absence of fear, but the presence of something stronger than fear. On Omaha Beach, men huddled behind obstacles, pinned down by withering fire from the bluffs above. Some were paralyzed by terror, and who could blame them? They had run into a nightmare, and every rational impulse told them to stay down, to wait, to hope someone else would solve this impossible problem. But then someone stood up. An officer, a sergeant, sometimes just a private who decided he'd rather die moving than die waiting. And that single act of terrified courage inspired another and another. Colonel George Taylor, moving among his men on that terrible beach, wasn't delivering a heroic speech when he shouted his famous words. He was stating a simple, brutal fact. There are two kinds of people who are staying on this beach, those who are D, and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here. It wasn't inspirational. It was mathematical. The only way forward was forward, even though forward meant running directly into the fire, and they did it. Somehow, impossibly, these terrified boys became the heroes history remembers, not because their fear disappeared, not because they suddenly felt brave, but because they chose, moment by moment, step by step, to act despite their terror. They advanced because staying still meant death. They helped their wounded buddies because leaving them meant living with that choice forever. They kept fighting because the alternative was surrender. And surrender meant everything they'd already sacrificed would be for nothing. This is the lesson of D-Day that we must carry forward. Courage is not a feeling. It's a choice. It's the choice to do what must be done, even when every fiber of your being is screaming in protest. It's the 19-year-old farm boy from Virginia stepping off that ramp. It's the medic going back for one more wounded soldier. It's the terrified private standing up when everything in him wants to stay down. These men were not fearless. They were fearful, full of fear, overflowing with it, and they went anyway. By the time the sun set on June 6, 1944, approximately 4,400 Allied soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. 4,400 remain abstracts, a statistic in a history book. Each one was a person. Each one had a name, a face, a mother who would weep when the telegram arrived. Each one represented a lifetime of possibilities that vanished into the sand and surf of Normandy. Private Robert Sales of Bedford, Virginia, was one of them. He fell in the first minutes on Omaha Beach, cut down before he could fire a shot, before he could take more than a few steps on French soil. His mother, back in Bedford, was still making his favorite meal that day, still praying for his safety, still believing he would come home. She didn't know yet that her son was already gone, that she would never see him graduate, never dance at his wedding, never hold his children. All of that future, all those ordinary, precious moments that make up a life, erased in an instant by a burst of machine gun fire. But Robert Sales wasn't alone from Bedford. The town had sent a company of men to war, boys who had grown up together, played baseball together, courted girls at the same church socials. By the end of D-Day, 30 of Bedford's sons were dead or dying. 30 young men from one small town. Bedford had a population of about 3,000 people. Nearly every family lost someone. The town lost an entire generation in a single day. Try to imagine that. Try to imagine being a mother in Bedford in the weeks after D-Day, watching telegram boys on bicycles come down the street praying they would pass your house, knowing that for some of your neighbors the prayer went unanswered. Imagine the memorial services, one after another, caskets that would never hold the bodies of the boys they honored because those bodies were buried in France or lost to the sea. Imagine the silence where laughter used to be. This was the cost, not in dollars or strategic objectives, but in human lives, in human suffering that rippled out from those beaches like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Every soldier who died had a mother. Many had wives, girlfriends, fiancés waiting for their return. Some had children who would grow up knowing their fathers only through photographs and stories. The cost of D-Day wasn't paid on the beach. It was paid in kitchens and bedrooms and small churches across America, Britain, Canada, and dozens of other nations. It was paid in tears and empty chairs at dinner tables and birthdays celebrated with one less candle because someone wasn't there to blow them out. Medic Robert Wright spent that day trying to stanch bleeding, trying to save lives with inadequate supplies and no real shelter from the fire raining down around him. He held the hands of dying boys who called out for their mothers in their final moments, who begged him to tell their sweethearts they loved them, who simply looked at him with eyes that asked why. He carried those moments with him for the rest of his life. That was his cost. Not a bullet wound, but the memory of all those faces, all those last words, all those boys he couldn't save. The soldiers who survived paid a cost too. We count casualties in terms of dead and wounded, but we rarely count the psychological wounds, the invisible scars. Harold Baumgarten shot multiple times on Omaha Beach, physically recovered, but he had nightmares for decades. The sound of fireworks sent him into panic attacks. He couldn't talk about D-Day with his family for years. The boy who went to Normandy never really came home. Something essential in him died on that beach, even though his body survived. Multiply that by thousands. Multiply that by the 156,000 men who landed that day, most of whom saw things no human being should have to see, who did things no person should have to do. They came home, many of them, but they came home different. They came home with trembling hands and night terrors and an inability to explain to anyone who wasn't there what it was like. That was part of the cost, too. And we must speak honestly about this. Many of them felt it wasn't worth it. Not in the moment, certainly. When you're watching your friends die, when you're soaked in blood and seawater, when you were so terrified you can barely think. In that moment, no cause seems worth this price. Some soldiers who survived D-Day came home angry, bitter, asking why they had to sacrifice so much, asking why their friends had to die, asking what kind of world demands such horror from its young people. On the German side, too, young men died. We speak less of them, and perhaps that's natural given the evil of the regime they served. But many of those German soldiers in the bunkers overlooking Omaha Beach were teenagers, conscripts who had no choice in being there. They had mothers, too. They had lives cut short, futures stolen. The tragedy of war is that it consumes the young on all sides, and D-Day consumed thousands of them. A German mother weeping for her son experiences the same grief as an American mother. The cost of war doesn't discriminate. The immediate casualties were just the beginning. In the days and weeks after D-Day, as the Allies fought inland, thousands more would fall. The Battle of Normandy would rage for months, claiming over 200,000 casualties on all sides. Boys who survived June 6th would die on June 7th or July 15th or August 3rd. The cost kept mounting, kept accumulating, kept creating more widows and orphans and grieving parents. Even those who made it through the war often paid delayed costs. Cancer from radiation exposure, chronic pain from wounds that never fully healed, alcoholism and depression as they tried to process what they'd experienced. Broken marriages because they couldn't connect with wives who hadn't shared their trauma. The cost of D-Day extended across decades, across lifetimes, and perhaps the cruelest cost was the one paid by those whose sacrifices were never acknowledged. The soldiers whose bodies were never found, who have no grave, no marker, who simply vanished into the chaos of battle. Their families never got closure, never got to say goodbye, never got to lay flowers on a grave. They were simply gone, and that uncertainty haunted their loved ones forever. We put numbers on it. 4,400 casualties on D-Day, 200,000 in the Battle of Normandy, millions across the entire war. But numbers are inadequate. They flatten horror into data. They turn tragedy into statistics. Behind every number was a beating heart that stopped. Behind every number was a family that would never be whole again. Behind every number was a lifetime of love and laughter and ordinary human joy that the world would never see. This is what freedom cost on June 6, 1944. Not abstract principles or noble ideals, but blood and bone and shattered lives. Real people with real dreams really died, really suffered, really sacrificed everything. They came from everywhere. From Kansas wheat fields where the horizon stretched endless and flat, where boys learned to drive tractors before they learned to shave. From fishing villages in Newfoundland, where the ocean had sustained families for generations, where young men knew the rhythm of tides and the bite of cold Atlantic wind. From coal mining towns in Wales, where fathers and grandfathers had descended into darkness, and sons expected to follow until the war offered a different kind of darkness to face. From Brooklyn streets, where immigrants' children played stickball and dreamed of futures their parents had crossed, oceans to provide. These were not professional soldiers. Most had never fired a gun before the war. They were farm boys and factory workers, shopkeepers' sons and mechanics' apprentices. They were teachers and salesmen and unemployed laborers, grateful for the steady pay of military service. They were ordinary in every conceivable way, ordinary backgrounds, ordinary educations, ordinary ambitions. They wanted what most young people want, to fall in love, to build something with their lives, to make their parents proud, to have families of their own. Private First Class Leo Hertner worked in his father's butcher shop in Pittsburgh before the war. He knew how to cut meat, balance accounts, charm customers into buying an extra pound of sausage. Nothing in his 22 years of life prepared him for wading through chest-deep water while machine gun fire churned the surf around him. He wasn't trained for heroism. He was trained to wrap parcels in brown paper and make change. Yet when his landing craft hit Omaha Beach and men started dying around him, something inside this ordinary butcher's son made him move forward instead of freezing, made him help pull wounded men to whatever cover existed, made him become someone he never imagined being. Sergeant Thomas Valance had been a high school English teacher in Nebraska. He taught kids to parse sentences and appreciate Shakespeare. He had never led men into combat, never imagined himself barking orders under fire. But on June 6, when his lieutenant was killed in the first minutes and his platoon was pinned down and disintegrating into chaos, this mild-mannered teacher stood up and started directing his students, because that's how he thought of them, as boys who needed guidance toward gaps in the German defenses. He wasn't John Wayne. His voice cracked when he yelled. His hands shook. But he led anyway. This ordinary school teacher turned extraordinary leader in the space of a heartbeat. The diversity of those who landed on Normandy's beaches reflected the diversity of the free world itself. There were Native Americans from reservations, Japanese Americans from internment camps proving their loyalty to a country that questioned it, African Americans from segregated units fighting for a freedom they didn't fully possess at home. There were Polish soldiers who had no country left to return to, French commandos landing on their own occupied soil, Norwegian resistance fighters finally striking back. Private James Arness, who would later become famous playing Marshal Dillon on television, was just a Minnesota kid at Anzio and later in France. Before the war, he worked odd jobs, couldn't quite figure out what to do with his life. The war didn't give him answers, but it gave him purpose. Or rather, it demanded purpose from him, whether he felt ready or not. Years later, he would say that everything he did afterward seemed easier because nothing could match the terror of those moments when ordinary life stopped and history demanded everything. These young men spoke different languages, came from different cultures, worshiped different gods or no god at all. A Jewish soldier from New York might find himself beside a Baptist farm boy from Alabama, next to a Catholic factory worker from Detroit, alongside a non-believer from San Francisco. Their accents were different, their references unfamiliar to each other, their worldviews shaped by vastly different experiences. In ordinary times, many of them might never have crossed paths, might never have found common ground. But in those landing craft on those beaches, none of that mattered. What mattered was simpler and more profound. They were in this together. The machine guns didn't discriminate based on background or belief. The mortars didn't care if you were rich or poor, educated or not, from the city or the country. And so these ordinary young men from extraordinary variety of backgrounds became brothers in the most literal sense, bound together by shared danger, shared purpose, shared determination to survive and help each other survive. Radio operator Robert Capa, the photographer, wasn't even supposed to be in combat. He was 30 years old, a Hungarian Jew who had fled fascism, an artist with a camera. But he landed with the first wave at Omaha Beach because he believed the world needed to see what was happening. His hands shook so badly from fear that most of his photographs came out blurred, but the few that survived became some of the most important documentation of D-Day. An ordinary photographer, terrified, seasick, wanting to be anywhere else, doing extraordinary work because the moment demanded it. Medic Waverly Woodson was an African-American soldier who landed on Omaha Beach and spent 30 hours straight treating wounded men despite being wounded himself. He pulled drowning soldiers from the water, performed amputations on the beach, saved dozens of lives. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor but never received it, likely because of the color of his skin. Just an ordinary medic from Philadelphia, doing extraordinary things while a racist system failed to recognize his courage. The young men who scaled the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc were Rangers, elite troops, but before the war, they had been ordinary too. Factory workers who got in shape, college students who wanted adventure, guys who were good at athletics and wanted to prove something to themselves. They climbed 90-foot cliffs under fire, not because they were superhuman, but because their training had convinced them they could, and their brothers needed them to succeed. Ordinary determination multiplied by extraordinary circumstances. What history shows us about D-Day is that heroism isn't a quality you're born with or a title you earn through exceptional breeding or education. It's something that emerges when ordinary people face extraordinary challenges and choose, moment by moment, decision by decision, to be better than they thought they could be. The butcher's son becomes a battlefield leader. The school teacher becomes a tactical commander. The photographer becomes a witness to history. The medic becomes as a savior. They didn't choose to be heroes. History chose them, dropped them into circumstances that demanded everything, and discovered what human beings are capable of when pushed beyond every limit they thought they had. These were not exceptional people in exceptional circumstances. These were ordinary people who became exceptional because the circumstances demanded it, and they refused to let their brothers down, refused to let evil win, refused to surrender to the easier choice of giving up. The plan was already falling apart before the first soldier set foot on French soil. Landing craft were sinking in the heavy seas. Paratroopers had been scattered across the Norman countryside, miles from their intended drop zones. Small groups of men wandering in darkness trying to find their units, their objectives, anyone who knew what was happening. Naval bombardment had missed many of the German fortifications. The careful choreography of the invasion, planned down to the minute by thousands of staff officers, was dissolving into chaos before dawn even broke. On Omaha Beach, the situation was approaching catastrophe. The German defenses there were far stronger than intelligence had suggested. The 352nd Infantry Division, battle-hardened troops, had reinforced the area just weeks before. Their machine gun positions were perfectly sited to create overlapping fields of fire across the beach. Their mortars and artillery had pre-registered every sector. They had turned this stretch of coastline into a killing ground, and the first waves of American soldiers were being slaughtered. By 8:30 that morning, General Omar Bradley, watching from the USS Augusta offshore, was consigned. Ring the unthinkable, evacuating Omaha Beach. The reports coming back were devastating. Massive casualties, units pinned down, no progress inland. Landing craft afraid to approach because the beach was so choked with dead and wounded. The entire invasion, the culmination of years of planning and the hopes of millions, seemed to be bleeding out on a strip of sand in France. But Bradley didn't know everything that was happening on that beach. He didn't know about the small groups of men who were finding gaps. He didn't know about destroyers moving dangerously close to shore to provide point-blank fire support. He didn't know about engineers blowing holes through obstacles despite horrific casualties. He didn't know about sergeants and corporals and privates who were leading without orders because their officers were dead, who were advancing because staying put meant certain death. The turning point at Omaha didn't come from some grand strategic maneuver or brilliant tactical innovation. It came from accumulated small acts of desperate courage, a Bangalore torpedo team reaching a barbed wire obstacle and blowing a gap, a squad finding a draw that wasn't quite as heavily defended and pushing through, rangers scaling the bluffs using nothing but ropes and grappling hooks and raw determination, destroyer crews risking their ships by coming so close to shore they could almost touch bottom, firing directly into German bunkers. By noon, American soldiers were on top of the bluffs. By afternoon, they were moving inland. The beachhead at Omaha, bought with such terrible cost, was secure, not because the plan had worked, the plan had failed spectacularly, but because individual soldi, RS junior officers, even some senior commanders who went ashore personally, had adapted and improvised and refused to accept defeat. At the other beaches, the story was different in detail, but similar in essence. At Utah Beach, the current had pushed the landing force a mile south of the intended spot. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., assistant division commander and son of the former president, was 56 years old and walking with a cane due to arthritis and a heart condition. He should have been watching from a ship. Instead, he landed with the first wave, surveyed the situation, realized they were in the wrong place, and made an instant decision. We'll start the war from right here. His calm leadership in those critical first minutes helped turn potential confusion into organized advance. The British and Canadian beaches, Gold Juno and Sword, had their own stories of chaos overcome by determination. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces faced heavy casualties but pushed inland farther than any other Allied force on D-Day, taking the town of Courseulles-sur-Mer. At Sword Beach, British commandos under Lord Lovat landed to the sound of bagpipes, Piper Bill Millen playing as men died around him, an act of defiance against the machinery of death. The paratroopers, scattered and disorganized, created their own kind of chaos that paradoxically worked in the Allies' favor. Small groups of Americans from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions coalesced around officers, non-coms, anyone who showed initiative. They seized bridges, blocked roads, created confusion behind German lines. The Germans didn't know where to commit their reserves because threats seemed to be emerging from everywhere. What looked like a disaster in execution became an accidental success in disruption. By the end of June 6, 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. 5 separate beachheads had been established. None of the day's objectives had been fully met. The Allies had expected to advance much farther inland, but the impossible had been accomplished. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. Hitler's fortress Europe had been penetrated. After years of German domination, Allied soldiers were back on the continent in force. The Germans had failed to push the invasion back into the sea, which was their only real hope. Every hour the Allies remained ashore, they grew stronger. More troops landed, more supplies came ashore. Engineers began constructing temporary harbors. The beachhead deepened and expanded. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded German forces in the area, had said before the invasion that the Allies must be defeated on the beaches or not at all. By nightfall on June 6th, he knew the battle for the beaches was lost. What made D-Day the turning point wasn't just the military success, as incomplete as it was what that success represented. For years, Nazi Germany had seemed unstoppable. They had conquered most of Europe. They had turned military victory into an art form. Their propaganda machine had convinced many that they were invincible, and now suddenly they were being beaten back by Americans who had been civilians 2 years earlier, by British soldiers who had evacuated from Dunkirk in defeat and returned for revenge, by Canadians and Poles and Free French and soldiers from a dozen other nations, all united against tyranny in Occupy Europe. People who had lived under Nazi rule for years heard the news on forbidden radios and wept with hope. In concentration camps, prisoners whispered that liberation might actually come. Resistance fighters emerged from hiding to harass German forces trying to move toward Normandy. The psychological impact was immense. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately on the Eastern Front, finally had the second front Stalin had been demanding for years. Now Germany faced enemies on all sides. Now the vast resources of America, Britain, and Canada were being brought to bear directly on Nazi-occupied France. The strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Germany could still fight, could still kill millions more, could still prolong the war, but they could no longer win it. Add any headings. 1643. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet. Tourists walk where soldiers fell, many of them completely unaware of the exact spot where someone took their last breath. Children build sandcastles in the surf where young men drowned under the weight of their equipment. Couples stroll hand in hand along the bluffs where machine guns once created fields of death. The concrete bunkers remain, weathered by decades of wind and rain, their firing slits now empty, their guns long removed. Grass grows on the scarred earth. Time has softened the landscape, but it cannot erase what happened there. In the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, 9,388 white crosses and stars of David stand in perfect rows overlooking Omaha Beach. The grounds are immaculate, maintained by workers who tend these graves with reverence. Each marker represents a life cut short, a family forever incomplete, a future that never came to pass. Visitors walk among them, trying to comprehend the scale of sacrifice. But numbers, even when visualized in endless rows of white stone, struggle to convey the human reality. Behind each marker was a person who laughed and loved and dreamed. Some visitors come because their grandfather or great uncle is buried there. They bring flowers, place small American flags, touch the stone as if somehow the gesture can bridge the decades and reach the young man they never knew. Some come because they feel obligated, because they were taught in school that this matters, though they're not entirely sure why. Some come as pilgrims, seeking connection to something larger than themselves, to a moment when the world hung in the balance and ordinary people tipped the scales toward justice. But most people will never visit Normandy. Most people will never stand on those beaches or walk among those graves. For them, D-Day is a date in a textbook, a scene in a movie, perhaps a ceremony on the news every 5 or 10 years when an anniversary is marked. The living connection to that day grows thinner with each passing year. The last veterans are in their 90s and hundreds now, their numbers dwindling rapidly. Soon there will be no one left who can say, I was there. No one who can describe the actual smell of the beach or the exact sound the bullets made hitting the water or the way fear tasted in their mouth. And this is why remembrance is not passive nostalgia, but active responsibility. Because without deliberate effort, D-Day will fade from collective memory the way all history eventually does. It will become abstract, sanitized, reduced to simplified narratives that miss the complexity and horror and humanity of what actually happened. Future generations will know there was an invasion, will know it was important, but they may not understand the weight of it, the cost of it, the human choice embedded in every moment of that day. Remembrance means telling the stories accurately, without glorification, but also without minimization. It means speaking Harold Baumgarten's name and knowing he was shot 5 times and survived and carried those wounds for the rest of his life. It means understanding that the Bedford boys were real people from a real town, not symbols or statistics. It means recognizing that every one of those 4,400 casualties on D-Day alone had a mother who grieved, and that grief deserves acknowledgement decades later. But remembrance is more than historical accuracy. It's recognition of debt. The world we inhabit today, the one where democracy, however imperfect, remains viable, where totalitarianism did not triumph, where millions who would have been murdered by the Nazi regime lived instead. That world was purchased on June 6, 1944, and in the months and years of fighting that followed, those young men on those beaches were dying for strangers, for people they would never meet, for us. This creates obligation, not guilt. We should not feel guilty for being born into the freedom others secured, but obligation, responsibility, a sense that we owe something to those who gave everything. We owe them the effort to preserve what they died for. We owe them vigilance against the forces they fought. We owe them the commitment to ensure their sacrifices were not in vain. That vigilance requires understanding that freedom is never permanently won. Democracy is not self-sustaining. Every generation must choose whether to defend the principles those soldiers fought for or to let them erode through neglect and indifference. The threats may look different now. We are not facing Nazi Germany in 2026, but the fundamental question remains, what are we willing to sacrifice for the common good? What are we willing to stand against even when it's difficult or costly or unpopular? The soldiers at Normandy didn't want to be heroes. They wanted to go home, to marry their sweethearts, to live quiet, ordinary lives. But when history demanded something of them, they answered. They put aside their individual desires and fears and chose something larger. That capacity for sacrifice, for collective purpose, for loyalty to ideals bigger than self-interest. That is what we must remember and cultivate in ourselves. Remembrance also means honoring the sacrifice through how we treat each other. Those men fought and died alongside people different from themselves, different religions, different backgrounds, different accents and customs. They learned that what united them was stronger than what divided them. When we allow ourselves to be torn apart by tribalism, when we demonize fellow citizens who disagree with us, when we fail to see the humanity in others, we dishonor what those soldiers stood for. It means teaching the next generation not just the facts of D-Day, but its meaning, not turning it into a jingoistic celebration of American superiority, but using it to illustrate what humans are capable of at their best. Courage in the face of overwhelming fear, sacrifice for others, determination against impossible odds, hope when all seems lost. These are not uniquely American or Allied virtues. These are human capacities that every generation must rediscover and choose to embody. The concrete bunkers on those beaches are deteriorating. Eventually, they will crumble completely. The last veterans will die, and with them will go the living memory of that day. The physical evidence of D-Day is temporary, but the choice to remember, to honor, to learn, to carry forward the values those soldiers embodied, that choice is renewable with each generation. We remember not to glorify war, which is always horror and should always be a last resort. We remember not to promote nationalism or militarism. We remember because on June 6, 1944, ordinary people proved that evil can be opposed, that tyranny can be defeated, that freedom is worth fighting for, and that individuals matter in the great sweep of history. We remember because those young men, terrified, ordinary, extraordinary, deserve to be more than forgotten names on weathered stones. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.